Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel here on YouTube is Discerning What is True. What I'm going to be doing today, this afternoon it is, a little after 5 o'clock here on the East Coast, is to be sharing the book Other Losses, which was written by a gentleman from Canada who was a Canadian soldier, James Bach, B-A-C-Q-U-E, who put this book out in 1989. Um, Most people don't know about this. Um, Very few people know that German soldiers were starved to death by the Allies. We have always knew that the Russians would do that, the Soviet Union would do that to their people, but it's misgiving, and most people would not even believe the story that this guy's done, sharing the information that basically the United States, France, and even Britain, although Britain was less, was involved in this to starve the Germans, um, mainly because of General Eisenhower. Uh, General Eisenhower was a Polish Jew, and no one seemed to actually deal with these questions. There were people frustrated, I think, in some ways we dealt with last chapter. But it seems as though he got his way. And he got his way in just about everything, folks. He was the supreme Allied commander. He actually took his time in a lot of ways to attack Germany when Patton wanted to continue to move it on. And the reason why was simply was that he was already brokered what I would call the deal to allow the Soviets or the Russians to get into almost all of Eastern Europe, you see, and to give that to them. That was given to them, folks. That was given to them. That is means the countries of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia. You know, that's a country now, but in the past it wasn't. Albania. You know, it formed all of what we call Yugoslavia. You see, and it was given to them, and they actually, they gave them even gave them East Germany. You see, that East Germany and West Germany was brokered off. The West gave the Soviet Union all this in order for them to be fighting in the war or simply just allowing Stalin to do whatever he wanted to do. And so this is a really a head scratcher, but then you have to realize that the Allies, the president, Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill almost gone. Actually, Stalin dominated the peace accord, so to speak. Okay, he dominated the whole outrage of this whole thing. But we know that Roosevelt was a socialist himself, and then Winston Churchill was he was a closet socialist. So they went along with this. Okay, so this is chapter 5. It's called The Summer of Starvation. The whole idea in this book to show you, to make you think here, is that these people, the German soldiers, were treated worse than actually humanity. And this went against the Geneva Convention, see. This all went against it. And yet they would do this trial, it takes up later in a year, and do this whole thing with the Germans, when in reality, our own government was complicit in what they were doing, actually disobeying the Geneva Convention, you see. And these people didn't have any way of keeping themselves warm. They were not given much water. They were given very little, probably 20% of what their rations are compared to American soldiers. And yet, the attitude, the instinct of a lot of them were simply as well, they justly deserved this because they started the war. But actually, excuse me, a little key here, folks. Second World War. Germany never attacked the United States, folks. You better get that in your head. You better figure it out. Because Germany never attacked Canada or the United States. And yet, Roosevelt, in his way of doing things, he baited the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. You need to understand that when it used to be at San Diego, you see, the Navy. What also you have to understand simply is what is taking place here is that Germany never officially declared war on against America because it didn't want to fight America. had no desire for that. But you have to understand simply as the instigators also was that Europe, that is Britain, wanted war to eliminate Germany's economic power, you see. And this is what they did, you see. And this is and in reality, no one's done anything about this. This is in 1945, you see. So this is 75 years ago. And no one, except this particular book I know of, other losses, the only thing I know of that actually talks about this. So General Eisenhower and Prime Minister Churchill talked about reducing prisoner rations on May 15th. Churchill asked for agreement on the scale of rations for prisoners because he would soon have to announce cuts in British meat ration. Okay? Let me just change this thing so it'll be easier for me to read. He wanted to make sure that as far as possible, they should be fed on those supplies which we could best spare. Eisenhower replied that he had already given the matter considerable attention. He'd been told that a scale of 2,150 calories were required, but he had already reduced this to 2,000. He'd already reduced it to 2,000. This scale for prisoners, he said, had for some time been lower than the Allied troops. Well, actually, he's lying there, folks. It was far less than 2,000. It was more like 200. Okay? They were starving them. Okay? The scale for prisoners, he said, had for some time been lower than Allied troops. For some U.S. troops, it was approximately 4,000 calories per day. He was planning to examine the whole thing further to see whether or not a further reduction was possible. He was talking about reducing rations for prisoners of war who were already dying or of starvation under the eyes of U.S. Army doctors. So I'm wrong. It was actually 2,150 calories. I misunderstood, didn't look at it here correctly. But he had reduced it to 2,000. So there was actually 2,000 calories less than what the American soldiers were getting at 4,000. Rations were reduced soon after this. Some of the prisoners of war continued to get some food from the U.S. and captured German stocks, but at lower scale. Now, they were getting it also from German stock. So it means simply it wasn't all coming from America, United States stocks. And there was plenty enough food, folks, also. A million others who had been receiving at least some food because of their national nominal POW status, that is simply has lost their rights and their food when they were secretly transferred to the DEF status. These people got far less than 2,000 calories mentioned by Eisenhower in many cases for a lot far less than half. What Eisenhower did not tell Churchill was that the Army was not feeding DEFs at all. They were not feeding them at all. They were starving them, or was feeding them for less than 2,000 calories per day while reducing the rations to the POWs. Operational rations C, K, and 10 and 1 will be used only as a last resort, said the orders. Every means of improvisation will be exhausted prior to their use. The 2,000 calories were the maximum at that date. Never was higher than that, folks, and only to be supplemented from U.S. food if German sources failed. In other words, the Americans would continue to hold on that food, you see, unless the German sources didn't have enough, so to speak, which they have already done in the 7th Army area around Munich and elsewhere. These orders applied only to captives who were officially recognized as being on hand. The reclassification to the DEF did not require any ship of men to new camps or new organizations to get German civilian supplies to them. The men stayed where they were with no more shelter or less. All that happened was that by the clatter of a typewriter, their skimpy bit of U.S. Army food was stopped. Patton was the only Army in the whole theater to release significant numbers of captives during May of 1945, saving many of them from starvation. Both General Omar Bradley and Lee ordered the release of prisoners on May 13th, but the supreme commanders of the European feeler orders signed Eisenhower countermanded them on May 15th. As a result, the meticulous General Lee, who was so worried about the famished state of the men for whom he was responsible that he fired off a challenge cable from his headquarters in Paris to the supreme leaders of the headquarters in Frankfurt. This headquarters is having considerable difficulty establishing adequate basis for requisition ration for prisoners of war currently held in theater. Prisoners on hand are in excess of estimated captures and in excess of numbers for which rations have been previously requisitioned from the zone of interior, that is the United States. Present food situation both in theater and zone of interior is extremely critical. Additional food supplies required to maintain minimum ration levels for prisoners of war cannot be obtained from zone of interior without firm complete justification. Several requests have been made by this headquarters for statement as to prisoners of war on hand, so that adequate basis can be established with War Department for placing requisitions for rations. In response to inquiries from the headquarters, several varying statements of numbers of prisoners held at theater had been published by the Supreme headmen at the European theater. So I'm going to give you a little bit of some information here, and we're going to show you, not going to show you, but we're going to talk about it. Let's see if I can balloon this up a little bit more. So the last is the daily POW reports of U.S. Army Theater Provost Marshal, June 2nd, 1945, shows a total of 2.87 million captives classified as prisoners of war, including those held by the 6th Army in the United States. Okay, this is National Archives here. So first, the weekly POW reports of U.S. Army Theater Provost Marshal, June 2nd, 1945, excludes over 1 million prisoners shown in the daily reports for the same day. And I'm showing this right now. I'm looking at it right now. So in reality, simply, they're covering up this stuff. Okay. And they're showing 3.1, almost 3.2 million men are actually located in these camps. And the total captured on hand, Europe, as a discrepancy among U.S. Army reports were, these are millions of prisoners here, okay? Let me reduce this thing again. I'll show you, not show you, but tell you what is going on. So General Lee had millions of prisoners. He had 5.319 million prisoners. There's others saying simply is that the Supreme leadership of the European theater was showing 4.368 million, okay, and on hand 2.927 million. And then the theater provost marshal of PWs were 2.87 million, 400,000. And then there were what they call DEFs, which basically was a perspective of simply DEFs is what I understand simply was these people were already gone. They were no longer going to provide any food for them. You see, they were expendable. Okay, and this is right at 1.1 million men, which is called the 12th Army Group, and that would have gotten them close to what it calls nearly close to 4 million. Okay, but there were also what I would call simply is what I'm reading here, that they were just simply giving out reports. They were not really actually being accurate about the reports. Dated 31st May states that 1.89 million prisoners of war and 1.2 million disarmed German forces on hand. So that's roughly 3 million people. But best available figures at this headquarters shows prisoners of war in Comp, that is in Comp Z, at being 910,980. Comp Z's transit enclosures with a little over 1 million, 1.02 thousand, and in the 12th Army Group it's 965,135, making a total of 2.878 million. An additional 1 million disarmed German forces that were in Germany and Austria. The situation was astounding. Lee was saying there were 1 million more men in U.S. Army camps in Europe than they were saying. In other words, the supreme commanders were not actually telling the truth. They didn't want to tell what was really going on. So Lee said there was approximately 3.878 POWs and DEFs. And on June 2nd, issued the first table showing only 2.927 million DEFs and POWs. So that's almost 1 million less. Okay. This went far towards defeating Lee's purpose of feeding the captives, because it was this Supreme Order G3 table that provides the basis for rationing the camps. We can actually see the captives disappear between two reports of the Theater Provost Marshal issuing on the same day. The last reported daily series of the TPM saying that there were 2.87 million POWs on hand at June 2nd, when he was saying, no, there's far more than that. Okay. And he was concerned, basically, he was looking at it this way. Where's the food? Okay. Where's the food for these guys? See, they were bringing the numbers down. That was how they were hiding it. You see? You follow what I'm saying? And then the first report of the new weekly series, dated the same day, says that there were only 1.836 million on hand. So Lee was wrestling with the wind. They simply ignored his meticulous figuring. There was nothing more he could do. He had to base his issue of food on the number of prisoners on hand given him by the Supreme Commanders, the G3, even though he knew it was low by over millions. Okay. This is an excuse. You see, they're not going to feed these people. That's their excuse. You see, it's a way of showing they're not going to feed these men. But they cover it up, you see. This million men's are called henceforth the missing million, to distinguish them from the other prisoners. That was one way that rations were reduced. Of course it was. That was their way of doing it. Another was through some strange doing in the Army's bookkeeping during June and July, when men with the POW status were secretly transferred to DEF status under the bizarre U.S. FET bookkeeping practice of June and July, which was divided into week-long periods ending at Saturday midnight, the closing balance for each week, which ought to be exactly the same as the opening balance of the following week, starting then 1 second later. Difference by any number the bookkeeper found convenient. From June 2nd through July 28th, the transfer and discharge come to 588,533 more than the drop from those on hand at the beginning of those on hand at the end. This midnight shift is deceitful, hidden from the casual observer, because the U.S. Fed FET tables do not give the opening balance each week, only the closing balance of the transaction producing it. So the innocent onlooker, assuming the open balance is omitted as an unnecessary repetition, but it wasn't. Begin working with figures that can never come out right, because hundreds of thousands of human beings are added or subtracted at the whim of a bookkeeper. Only when the figures are painstakingly checked category by category, week by week for many sets, does this deception slowly become apparent. This supply of men did not come from the minds of the bookkeepers, though. They had no reason to invent fictitious captives, nor did they. Just as the DEF total rose, although no new captures were made, so the prisoners of war on hand declined by far more than the discharges, which were the only shrinkage reported. During the period from June 2nd to July 28th, the prisoners of war on hand shrank by 586,000 men, more than the discharges, while on hand at DFL camps rose by 588,000 men. So likely 2,000 off. This shift from disastrous POW status to the catastrophic DEF status was made deliberately over many weeks with careful attention to maintain plausible balance in the weekly POW and DEF reports. This discrepancy between those shifted from POW status and those received in the DEF status is only 0.43%. So successful was this deception that it went undiscovered for 17 years after the documents were opened to everyone in the world, including German scholars. The effect of the policy conveyed by winks and nods without written orders was first to mystify, then to frustrate, then to exhaust the middle rank officers who had to cope with the deaths that result. So what's happening here is the top people, such as Mr. Eisenhower at the top, is they're fiddling with the numbers, and they're not going to feed these people because they don't see them. They don't see them. You see, that's according to their records. Yet the ones that are actually lower than them are the ones going to have to deal with this shit. They're going to have to deal with the men who are actually dying out in the open fields, folks, with barbed wire around them, with select towers in each area with machine gun rounds ready to shoot, and anyone tried to escape. And there were many men who tried to escape and who wouldn't because of what was going on. They were getting dysentery. They were so close together. There was no place adequate for them to use the restroom. There wasn't no restroom, folks, you see. And then eventually people got so weak they actually defecated within their own clothes. And that's when it went completely, you know, bonkers. They knew what they were doing. It was a controlled way of killing people, you see, because disease by dysentery would allow this to happen, and people would catch it, you see. So it was a perfect way. And it was also, guess what? No, it was never in a city or anywhere of that nature. And there were actually one group was actually near a river. I mean, 100 yards away from a river, and no one fetched water for them. So you can see why people, the soldiers realize this is certain death here, and I'm going to take a chance. So fully aware that normal requisition methods would not promptly bring the required methods, and that captured stocks could not be expected from Army sources without special pleading, and then only in token quantities. That's why even the Catholic people were involved, and also the Red Cross were involved, and they're trying to tell people such and such that were basically the men in charge, that is the total men totally in charge, just listen to them and maybe would send a little bit of such and such, but in reality, it was a joke. Colonel Smithers in the quartermaster's section of Ad Sex wrote a personal plea to Quartermaster Robert Littlejohn on April 27th. Aside from the 750 tons received from the 15th Army, no assistance had been received, or do I expect any. What desirable Class 2 and Class 4 rations we have received has been entirely at the suffrage of the armies upon personal appeal, and has been insignificant in relation to the demand which are being put upon us by the influx of prisoners of war. We have taken every means of our command to increase these amounts, but with negligible results. On May 23rd, Quartermaster Littlejohn told his good friend Bob Crawford, Assistant Chief of Staff, G4 Staff Supplies, I do know I cannot continue to feed 3 million of these prisoners. He also reported that he could not supply the needed clothing in camp. So what's going on here? These guys are not getting the supplies. They're just not. They're not getting the food. So how in the world are they going to be able to feed these people? They can't. It's all at the top, folks. It's not at the bottom. Yeah, there's some bad things that happen at the bottom, correct, but it's actually at the top where all this is happening. It would not have happened, but Eisenhower actually had complete control of this, and he allowed it to happen. Okay? And in reality, folks, that's the genocide that took place. That's the real genocide. And the ones that were actually on the other side, on the Eastern Front, most of them never even survived, folks. They were used by the Soviet Union, and they were done away with. They never got home. Never even got a chance to get home. He also reported that he could not supply the needed clothing and camp equipment, such as tents, because the War Department had never furnished them. So this is up at the top. In fact, a number of my requisitions had been disapproved. He does not say why he could not issue tents from the stocks on hand, which were plentiful. He also asked his friend, U.S. Army Major General Ray Barker, at the Supreme Commanders, to assign an assistant to study the problem. On May 30th, General Barker took up the cry, telling Eisenhower Chief of Staff Udell Smith that the problem of feeding and maintaining maintenance of the very large numbers of prisoners of war and disarmed German forces now in Allied hands has become acute. It's a serious situation here, buddy. You see, but this is again on deaf ears. You see, the Chief of Staff, and they're all these guys are, they've got areas that actually are holding too many people within the boundaries of what we call barbed wire, and they know that. There's too many of them, but they let them figure it out. You see, the top brass is not doing anything about it. So that the evasion of responsibility by the shift of status was a forgettable fiction in the minds of the more realistic officers seen here at Barker referred to the feeding of all captives, not just prisoners or war. The recommendation, however, was not that they should be fed, but that they should be discharged. In other words, they should be let go. Such disbandment must, however, allow for the labor requirements of the United Nations. Now, here's the key word of the United Nations. So you see what's going on here? It's no longer in Irish jurisdiction. We have given this requirement to the United Nations for reconstruction work outside of Germany. So already your country is already giving its power to an entity itself is worthy of any power. Okay. Therefore, a cable was drafted. The combined chief of staff urgently requesting reply to an earlier cable to which there has been no response. The next day, a cable signed. Eisenhower remarked on the prisoner problem to Washington, pointing out that the British were not performing under the 50-50 prisoner sharing agreement. The cable complained that they were liable for at least 935,000 German more than they had, and possibly many more. But he also contradicted himself in the next sentence with the statement that the U.S. has held for them an average of 150,000. The cable ends urgent recommend transfers to partially relieve a very serious situation. On June 4th, another cable signed with Eisenhower name told Washington that if it's imperative necessary to arrange for the early disposal of large number of prisoners of war and disarm enemy forces still here in Europe. It's hard to understand what prompted this cable. No reason for it evidence in the massive cable traffic that survives in Abilene, London, and Washington. Eisenhower himself had only a few days earlier prevented Bradley, Lee, and Patton from releasing DEFs, far from ordering Eisenhower to take on hold onto prisoners. So you see there's a lot of lying going on here. The combined chief's message of April 26th had urged him not to take any more prisoners, even for labor after VE Day, victory over Europe. Yet the Army had taken in more than 2 million DEFs after that. There's no need to cable Washington for permission to discharge prisoners, for Patton had already discharged 500,000 men in 27 days. He just let them go. He didn't see them as a threat. They didn't have arms. If the other whole U.S. Army had discharged prisoners at the same rate as Patton, all the Germans would have been gone by the end of June. But only about 500,000 or 10% had been discharged by June 2nd. About 2.2 million were still discharged by September 8th. The other 3.7. So we're talking about, look at this number here. This is 5.9 million, okay, of the total American take in all European theaters was still in their camps or dead or transferred to British or French custody. Field Marshal Montgomery believed the Americans had loaded themselves down with huge numbers of prisoners out of vainglory, not military necessity. Yeah, they took this burden on in order to eliminate these people. You see, when all Germany laid virtually defenseless before Bradley in April, he halted the entire American effort of the 12th Army Group to clean up the rural, allowing himself to be infected by the American preoccupation with numbers of prisoners, bags, like some proud participant in a Scottish shoot. Bradley wrote later, my most pressing task in early April was to mop up the rural. Fortunately, almost all the German forces inside the rural pockets surrendered without a fight. The total bag by April 18th was done by intelligence estimates at 317,000 men. This was a larger German force than the Russians had captured at Stalingrad, or than we had captured Tunisia. General Patton taking prisoners was a sporting event, so he proudly counts in his books only those taken in war, not rounded up in peacetime, although the numbers went into the millions. Eisenhower asked for more food on May 4th. Then, as it was arriving, he asked permission to distribute it if he could find it necessary to avoid trouble in Germany that might be prejudicial to military operations. So there's this fear that they're having, so to speak, that somehow Germany's going to maybe fight again. You see, this is what they're thinking. But who knows if that's even true. He referred to the present critical shortage of food supplies, not only in the theater, but also in the United States, which had necessary 10% reduction in ration of all officers, enlisted personnel, and civilian employees. The world food shortage was now supposed to be affecting not only the Army, but the whole of the United States, where in fact there were surpluses of wheat and corn higher than they had ever been. Yes, folks, and production of potatoes higher than it ever had been to. This is all bullshit. They're lying. The 100-day black backlog of rations shown in the April report of the quartermaster in Europe was sufficient for 5 million people at 4,000 calories per day. It was enough. They already had it. The most important study of the situation done in June by Lieutenant General A.E. Grassett, G-R-A-S-S-E-T-T, for the Supreme Command, said that the present food situation in Western Germany is critical. It is estimated, however, that 630,000 tons of imported wheat will meet the minimum food needs of German civilians prior to the next harvest. There was no doubt in Grassett's mind that the wheat was there to be requisitioned. In fact, it was already arriving as previously planned and continued to arrive that summer as foreseen. The supposed 10% reduction in rations was a morsel of propaganda which fed the gullible, not the starving. No reduction in the Army allotment of 4,000 calories per day was noticed by Lieutenant Fisher, who recollected that except for a few days at Bastogne, we had plenty of food all the time, as the G4 records show. I never heard of a reduction in rations, nor did Colonel Henry C. Settle, in replacement command of the 106th Division at La Halle, who was in charge of 4,000 U.S. soldiers. We have so much food we didn't know what to do with it, said Settle. Our problem was cooking it. The general records of the quartermaster confirmed the individual experience. There was a huge food surplus in the Army, existing besides starvation in the camps. This surplus didn't account for U.S. Army personnel actually grew during the period when Othere said that rations for U.S. Army personnel were cut. The intake from U.S. and local, that is German sources, grew by 7% during this period. A few days after the flurry of cables telling Washington that food was short, there was a meeting with the Supreme Commander's economic branch to discuss the problem. High representatives of the Army and American Red Cross were looking for ways to get existing Red Cross food parcels to civilian displaced persons, DPs, and Lieutenant Colonel Bailey at the Supreme Command said that the Supreme Command was not in a desperate need of extra foodstuffs, but that the situation in Europe in the winter was going to be difficult. There were 13 million Red Cross food parcels in Europe, each which could provide 500 calories per person per day for 1 month. In addition, the French had 1.6 million, not counted in the general pool. Far from depriving itself of food to feed the starving masses of Europe, by early July, the Army was in fact taking food from Europeans, including Czechs and Germans, not only to feed prisoners, but in fact for its own purpose. The procurement figures of the Quartermaster General show that although in June the Army issued slightly more rations, that is 5,000 per day, than the requisition from the U.S. and local sources from the POW. During July, he was running a huge daily surplus on the prisoners' account from U.S. and local procurements. The Army took in 2.5 million more rations per day in July on the prisoners' account that it issues to the prisoners. In August, this rose to 3 million per day. This phrase, local procurement, refers to the Army's requisition of food from Germans, which was causing massive shortages. Refugees were starving as a result, according to the International Red Cross. So what's going on? I'm running here. I'll continue on. Maybe I should continue. Lieutenant Colonel Bach of the French Army in the French occupied zone of Germany received an outraged report from one of his units that a raiding party of Americans had seized 100 sheep from the local villages. The State Department complained to the War Department in June that certain areas in Czechoslovakia, that is 100,000 tins of meat, many tons of dry peas and sugar, cattle, and 700 stud horses had been confiscated as booty. The situation was summarized by objective observer, that is M. Layeyan, a French diplomat, who reported to Paris that the authorities among the Allies have closed their eyes to the requisitions made for the provisions of troops stationed in Germany. These come to a very considerable total. General Littlejohn himself said it was urgent and essential to protect indigenous stock, that is of German food, which are being rapidly depleted, and a serious shortage is anticipated during the winter and early spring. In August, Littlejohn repeated exactly what Lee had said in May. The Army was reporting fewer prisoners than ever it had. They were purposely lying about it, folks. After an extensive tour in his train through the Army areas to find out what was going on, Littlejohn concluded in a long memorandum written for the Commanding General of the Theater Service Forces on August 27th that the Army data was so inadequate that the true number of people to be fed was higher than reported by 1.55 million people. They totaled 5.25 million as compared with the official requisition base of 3.7 million. He wrote, it was necessary to study holdings of the POW and Army needs for labor in the theater to replace U.S. personnel going home. Only thus could a authoritarian basis be made for requisition rations from the United States. He strongly recommended that accurate data as the number of PWs, disarmed Germans, displaced persons, and civilians who are a responsibility of the American forces be assembled and published so that the proper action may be taken in the ration requisition prepared for by the office. This should include a factual statement of those who are our responsibility. The 960,000 DPs in the U.S. zone are being fed from indigenous stock, supplemented by issues from civil affairs stocks, which were themselves partially derived from local procurement. Littlejohn expressed concern about shortages only in Germany. He mentioned no shortages anticipated or existing in the Army, zone of the interior, or the world. The Army had so much food that when a whole warehouse full was dropped from the supply list by accident in England, it was not noticed for 3 months. Approximately 6% of the permanent surplus of Army rations in Europe would have supplied enough food, an extra 1,300 calories per day to keep alive for 100 days. That is 800,000 people in the camps who were starving in the midst of plenty. They were starving these people on purpose. There was no rationale for this, folks. That's my point. The obstacle that stood in the way of getting food to the prisoners was still the inaccurate rationing figures, although this has already been noticed in Lee's rocket of June 2nd, which he attempted to correct it. Littlejohn's memo, decisive, well-written, and urgent, once again recommends clearing up the problem by clearing up the figures. In August as in June, this high-level effort had no effect on the rationing in the camps. Nothing changed, folks. Nothing. The death rate among the newly created DEFFs continued to rise through September 8. The squalor of the camps came from the moral squalor of polluting the higher levels of the Army. These officers were so cynical about the prisoners that while they were writing their anxious memos, presumably to absolve themselves of blame, if it ever came, so all of them are coming up now. Their underlines in at least 6 cases refused to let German civilians bring food to the people in the camps. There were German civilians who were willing to bring food to the soldiers, and they turned them away every time. Lieutenant Fischer was told by several German women that they had been refused permission to take food to their husbands in the camp near Frankfurt in the summer of 45. 10-year-old Herbert Thalion at Reinsberg was the only civilian permitted to bring food to that camp. The prisoners starving in 3 U.S. Army camps at Dietersheim, taken over by the French Army in July of 1945, had never been supplied from local sources, which were abundant at the time. The most damaging ban covering all the U.S. camps was imposed by the War Department against the mailing of Red Cross parcels to the prisoners. This ban was extended to cover even donations which the German prisoners in the U.S. wanted to make to help clothe and feed prisoners in the camp in Europe. The Germans in the U.S. were forbidden by the Secretary of Treasury Frederick N. Vinson, V-I-N-S-O-N, to specifically take any gifts that they made to the Red Cross would be delivered to the European prisoner camps. The refusal of mail was the refusal of life, folks, just as it would have been to Allied prisoners in German hands during the war, when much of their food arrived via mail from the Red Cross. Surplus food parcels which the Red Cross had gathered in various countries were confiscated by the Supreme Command. In any case, the Army had imposed a limit on the amount of food that could be provided from German sources for the men in the DEFF camps. These men are authorized at a maximum of now 1,150 calories per day for non-workers and 1,850 calories for workers. This was sentencing them to death in a very short time, especially considering the lack of shelter and clean water. They didn't even provide, as reading last night, they were not providing even cups for these guys to drink out of a cup. All they could do is basically come there and drink water. They just get it out of their hand and just put it to the face, and they don't have to move on because there was such a long line. The shortage of goods in Germany was caused partly by the prevention of manufacture for export trade, which could have been quickly reestablished. Germany still had about 75% of her manufacturing capacity in operation on May 8th. Some of the shortage was caused by the imprisonment or deaths of so many potential workers. Coal was lacking for processing the crops that were coming in, so it was transferred in field labor. In the British zone, which was by far the most devastated and populous, the German cores of wheat and rye were coming in at a surprisingly high rate, over 70% of normal, mainly because the British rapidly discharged prisoners to help with the harvest during Operation Barleycorn. Barleycorn. On August 4th, when the captives still in hand in the United States camps were only about 50% of the total captured because of death, discharge, or transfer. A one-sentence order signed, Eisenhower condemned all prisoners to the worst possible condition. Effectively, immediately, all members of the German forces held in U.S. custody in the American zone of occupation in Germany will be considered as disarmed enemy forces, not as having the status of prisoner of war. No reason is given for the POWs now being treated like DEFs. The death rate quadrupled within a few weeks, from 0.2% per week to 0.8% for the week ending September 8th. Eisenhower did this on purpose. Or either someone was telling him what to do above him, but I believe that he basically doing it himself. Eisenhower had deplored the Germans' useless defense because of the waste of life, but Germans were dying far faster now than they had surrendered than they had during the war. At least 10 times as many Germans died in the French and American camps that were killed in all the combat on the Western Front. You hear that? Say it again. At least 10 times as many Germans died in the French and American camps as were killed in all the combat on the Western Front in Northwest Europe from June 41 to April 45. Almost 4 years. A vicious indifference spread downward into all the guard personnel and even into the medical corps doctors assigned to the camps. While massive supplies of surpluses of food went unused, 4,000 cavalry officers visited the camps asking for details about the dead. In their general report of the survey, the doctors specified with excruciating precision that the cause of death, which could only have been attained in many cases by autopsy of the famished, stinking, dangerous corpses. Except in the death total, these reports have the coherent detail of authenticity, undistracted by any note of sympathy, outrage, or honor. So all these guys who are in charge here began to go along with the program. They're not looking at them as truly human beings, you see. What if that was you? You see, what if that was you? You know, what if the Germans, were doing that to American soldiers? I don't know yet. We'll see. The doctors were, see, they note the incidence of intimate symptoms in the living such as Vincent's angina, scavenged gingivitis, all culminated from visits to camps holding 80,000 men during May. Camps along the Rhine between May 1st and June 15th. Medical corps officers recorded a horrendous death rate of 80 times as high as anything they have ever observed in their lives. They officially totted up the causes of death, so many from dysentery or diarrhea, so many from typhoid fever, tetanus, susceptibility, all a race unheard of since the Middle Ages. How dare you do that? This is unbelievable. You need to hear the truth of what your country's all about here in America. We're not such a great country, folks. You better figure that out. You should be upset about things of this nature. People died needlessly here. Medical terminology itself was strained by the catastrophe to which they were witnessing. People were reported dead, emaciation, and exhaustion. The three major killers were diarrhea and dysentery, treated as one category, cardiac disease and pneumonia. As a survey prepared by these doctors show, other causes directly attributed to exposure, overcrowding, and lack of sanitation were important killers as well. The ETO doctors found that only 9.7% of the 15% of the prisoners had died of causes clearly associated with lack of food, such as emaciation and dehydration and exhaustion. Others died of diseases caused by the foul exposure condition, which were undoubtedly exacerbated by starvation. As the report noted, in evaluation of these data, considerations must be given to the age groups of the prisoners. Their age ranged from 14 to well over 50. Many were captured in exhausted state. Others were formerly hospital patients. Exposure, overcrowding of pens, and lack of food and sanitary facilities all contribute to the excessive rates. The surveying doctors were calm in their knowledge that former patients like young Heinz T were taken from their hospital beds and sent sick and half naked in the barbed wire cages to sleep in the mud, while thousands of beds in the same hospital went empty. In the figures for the so-called hospitals, the ETO survey doctors noted rates for many diseases, but none for exhaustion or malnutrition. Wow, they covered it up. The widespread disease were common respiratory conditions, diarrhea, and dysentery again, accounting for some 85% of the so-called emissions. Okay. These derive much more from filth and exposure than from starvation. But in reality, it's probably the reverse of that. These people starved to death. They covered it up even here. These data was taken from POW camps, not from the DEF camps. It must be remembered. So it is plain that as early as May 1st, the prisoners of war, who apparently were the best treated, were already exposed to conditions that killed them at the rate of over 30% per year. No trace of any study of causes of death among the DEF have been found, but it's clear from the evidence of survivors that conditions were similar to those in the POW camps examined by the ETO medical survey, except that they were worse nutritionally. The doctors noticed the situation in these camps were typical enclosures in the other commands. Other officers looked indifferently on the dying prisoners in their traps. The dim-witted General Holler, Provost Marshal at the Advanced Section Commander Communications Zone, discussed the situation in the prisoner of war temporary enclosure at a meeting on May 28. He opened the meeting with a statement that the reports from the 106th Division showed progress. The overall population will drop some 25,000 on this day report on account of evacuations, discharges, and losses, etc. However, the reports later issued by his own Provost Marshal officer for that day showed no discharges, no evacuations, and a maximum transfer to defense of 1.3, little over 14, right almost 1,400 men. Provost Marshal reports are so sloppy done that it's impossible to say from reference to them if Holler predicted line ever took place, but in the 4 days between May 20th and the 30th, no drop occurred the size reported by Holler. At the same meeting under Holler, burials at Rheinberg on the 27th, presumed for men who died on the 26th, were reported to be 10. At Sing Sing was 32, and Benjamin 24, meaning annual birth rates of 6.7% up to 27%. The term burial may be a euphemism for burial in common graves, because the figures for POW deaths are different in the Provost Marshal report. These were for May 25th and 26th, either 0 or 191, depending on which page of the TPM, that is the Theater Provost Marshal report, you believe. The report offers both figures, but at Holler meeting, the report's burial total only 66. Also, in the reports from Holler's Provost Marshal officer deaths, which had been reported at 156 from May 26, were corrected soon to only 60. The one comment on General Holler on these whirling death totals was, I wonder whether or not Sensing had received the supply of physiological warfare newspapers in the last couple of days. Would you check? The colonel in charge of the fatal absent supplies, he said, was there anything at that meeting yesterday, G4, that would be of interest to the meeting? And Colonel Lockett replied, nothing of interest. The quality of thought given to the problem may be seen in the exchange between Colonel Stedman and General Holler. Stedman remarked that 106th Division had been ordered to release prisoners in categories that include almost every PW. He asks, I wonder if we are not bottling the division now. General Holler appears not even to notice that what Stedman is saying, because he replies that 106 has been advised and the definition of categories missing completely the point that the release of almost all the prisoners had apparently just been ordered. Then he adds, I would be willing to let them get their machinery set up before bogging them down. To which Colonel Venley adds that they also had a large amount of civilians on hand. Holler says that the civilians will be evacuated as soon as there is a report about them. The report was never written or else never implemented because the civilians, including women and children, were still in these camps when the French started taking them over in July and August. In the midst of chaos, General Holler stood firm for the status quo. The status quo. Lieutenant R.H. Burbage wrote of the visit to Charles von Lützow camp that the surgeon and chief of preventive medicine returned yesterday from a 2-day trip to the Rwandan PWTE, that is, prison of war, temporarily enclosed. It was found that a large number of prisoners had been located deep in foxholes from which they had not moved for days, either to report on sick call or to eat. The report goes on to emulate various remedies that were planned but not taken. Rumors of the investigation in the camps ran through the army, making every man shut them if he could. Boy, those camps were bad news, said B.K. Soberitsky, a technical sergeant in the medical corps. We were warned to stay as far away from them as we could because they were so badly organized and short of supplies. The censorship imposed by the Supreme Army in Europe after VE Day was stricter than it had been during the actual fighting. The New York Times argued vigorously with this policy in a front-page news story on May 27th. American people are being deprived of information to which they are entitled. It seems almost as though now there is no enemy to fight. High Army officials are spending a larger part of their time writing directives or to circumstance to circumvent the movement and activities of war correspondents. Eisenhower was fairly open about this. I have always considered a quasi-staff officer's correspondent accredited to my headquarters. He told a medium American newspaper editors, this wasn't good journalism, says Charles Litch, the Canadian war correspondent. It wasn't journalism at all. By the end of May, more people had died in the U.S. camps than died in the atomic blast of Hiroshima. Not a word reached the press, though. So I thought I'd share this with you. I think this is still important, even though it's 75 years away. And very few people know this. Most don't understand what happened during the Iraqi War. Are you well aware of what the United States did there? The United States took these surrendered men and they killed them all. They violated Geneva Convention again. So how dare we talk about other countries that are quote unquote not following the Geneva Conventions when these people would do this, the other thing, they would actually cause harm to other people. This is these are bad men at the top. Eisenhower definitely was. Eisenhower was used just like Woodrow Wilson in some ways. And eventually what happened was he came out and spoke out about the military-industrial complex. But he was a part of that military-industrial complex for a long time, folks. You can go all the way back to the bonus army that actually came to Washington back in the 1920s. Guess who the three people were there who were involved? One was Dwight Eisenhower. The other two were MacArthur and Patton. And you'll see that what we did even then, when General MacArthur actually attacked the bonus army with tear gas and machine guns in the city of Washington, D.C. That's what your government did back then. What do you think they're going to do to you now, folks? Think about it. How they treated these men who were promised a bonus after the end of World War I for signing up for additional, they were going to fight more than they were supposed to. It was only supposed to be 2 or 3 years or whatever war. And then they said, well, we sign up and they'll get a bonus. It tells you a lot about congressmen. All they do is lie. That's all they do. You need to understand this very clearly, that all presidents or whatever they've been in office, they lie to you. They never tell you the truth, folks. They never will. Because it's so corrupt there. It's immensely corrupt, these people are. They'll lie to you in your face here and not think about it. They'll promise you something, tell you something, and they'll lie to you. It's time for people here in this country to stop being so gullible and believe in these con people. These people didn't come from the bottom, folks. These are the well-to-do people, most of them are. And I mean, most of your leaders are. They come from well-to-do families, you see. It's amazing still when you look at the whole thing. I understand that Mr. MacArthur actually was in charge of the Japanese theater, but Patton was underneath Eisenhower. But Eisenhower was given a position that most people don't understand how he got in that position, because it basically was a political move. It wasn't based upon leadership and doing the right thing. He was already compromised in his way he led our troops. And then you see what they did here in this chapter, where more and more people died of starvation who had already, quote unquote, had surrendered. And what transpired was simply, if you follow this, our government, along with Eisenhower, allowed this to happen, allowed it to happen. And you think that we are good people, and yet you see what we do to other countries, and we point to figures. We think we're such great people and boast our chest up, so we're a great country. And the only great people are actually the commoners, folks. Just the little guys down here on what we call on the street, so to speak. They're the only ones who we call good people, somewhat. Because what you look at, you see all these other people are, they could care less. You see. So we do know simply is that it took a lot of bravery to these gentlemen from wrote the book, Canadian officer, doing this. How would you feel that you had people coming from your own territory willing to feed German soldiers who were, they were Germans, and rightfully so? Are you aware you even had, I don't know what it's like here in America, there were German prisoners here where I live at. There were German prisoners, they were brought over here on ships or planes, one of the two, where I live at. And they were actually on a POW camp here in Aiken, South Carolina. And they were used, since there were very few men here at this point, they say, who knows, that they were used to do work around for farmers, such to speak. And it's just interesting to look into that there were other camps here in the United States. But no one ever talks about this other thing simply is that they were in a war. So I understand there'd be in a POW camp. And as far as I know, they were treated fine here. They worked, but they got fed. But what about the Japanese people who were taken, they were just happened to be citizens of this country, and they were taken, thrown into, basically into concentration camps, folks? Your own country does this. Your own country did this. And it was done by, President Roosevelt, you see. These people that you look up to, they're not worthy of respect at all. Why would you do that? Oh, the Japanese might be a threat, such and such, on the Pacific coast. Okay, maybe, but why do you build camps for them to put them away from other people too? This is unbelievable, folks, what happened. So, and they didn't obey the Geneva Accords. They didn't obey any of that. They just did what they wanted to do. They kept it under wraps. And then what happened was the middlemen who were trying to do what's right, eventually they get exhausted because no one's listening to them. And rightfully so. They're frustrated because they're dealing with a situation and they're not getting help from the top. And eventually it gets to the point it's a massive cover-up. Everybody's a part of it then. They just cover it up. They're going to, as they would say simply, they're covering their ass because they now don't want to get in trouble, you see. So they're now writing different numbers, such and such, so they don't get in trouble. So not even being honest anymore. But they were exasperated basically because the top command was allowing this to happen and say there was only far fewer such and such troops here, that is prisoners, when there were far more. And then they didn't have what we call the adequate thinking, or not adequate thinking, but put them all together as though they wanted it to happen. They wanted them to get sick. They wanted to starve them. They wanted them to get sick and have nowhere to actually, no shelter, no buildings for camps. There are no buildings, folks. Nothing to protect them. And they're already weak as it is. And they're not getting fed, not getting water. It just gets worse. And you're in that environment, you see, they were already drinking their own urine too. They were drinking their urine. But how much urine can you do if you don't drink enough water? See, eventually that won't work. Think about it. If you're doing urine therapy, if you don't drink water, you won't have any urine. Because the other way actually you excrete what we call water in your body is through sweating. But obviously that didn't happen, maybe because this was during the cold weather, although maybe in the summertime it was quite the opposite. Well, that water's gone, that sweating's gone. So you have less and less urine. That's just my contention here. But I just think that simply is people need to know the truth. Even though it's 75 years ago, um, people need to know the truth. And you got to understand simply is um, it hasn't changed because we did the same thing in Iraq. We killed those people. They surrendered us to us peacefully, and we killed them. We did. We attacked a country that basically never attacked us, folks, dude. All because George W. Bush wanted to attack them. Yes men, you see. Don't put, this whole thing, these people, you think these great people, the Republican Party's here or the Democrat Party, it's all bullshit, folks. Time to open up your eyes and see the truth. You've been lied to for over 100 years, if not more, in every category it can be out there. And it's best that you actually don't trust these people anymore because they're not worthy of trust in the first place. That's when your eyes open up. You realize simply they're no more. In fact, they're not authority over you, you see, because in reality, they don't do the right things. They're not moral people. They bend. They compromise. You see. Anyway, I appreciate you being here. It's a little over an hour. Thank you for being here. Again, we'll deal with another chapter maybe the next day or two. Other losses. It took a lot of guts for this guy, actually, the soldier, and he actually met with other people who meticulously went over this information. This stuff was covered up, folks, too. A lot of it was already burned, dealt with. The files were burned. Some would just happen to be in the right place that the guy looked for. But in reality, simply a lot of this was covered up, too. You see. All right. Wish you a good evening. You have a good night. You take care, and thank you for listening and being a part of this program. Take care.